In the heart of ancient Rome, amid the grandeur of temples, the roar of the Forum, and the shadows of emperors, there existed an order of women whose lives were unlike any others. They were the Vestal Virgins, priestesses chosen in childhood, sworn to serve the goddess Vesta, guardian of the sacred flame that symbolized the very life of the Roman state. For 30 years they lived under vows of chastity, discipline, and devotion, for their purity was believed to ensure the prosperity and safety of Rome itself. But for those who broke their vow of chastity, the punishment was one of the most terrifying and unique in all of history. It was not death by sword, by fire, or by crucifixion. Instead, it was burial alive. The Romans revered the Vestal Virgins as more than priestesses. They were symbols of divine favor. Chosen between the ages of 6 and 10, these girls were taken from their families and inducted into the House of the Vestals, a sacred residence within the Roman Forum. For the first decade, they learned rituals and discipline under the watchful eyes of elder Vestals. In the second decade, they performed their duties, tending the eternal flame, drawing holy water, and safeguarding sacred objects believed to hold Rome's fortune. In the final decade, they trained the novices who would come after them. Their vow of chastity was central to their role. The purity of the Vestals reflected the purity of Rome itself. To break that vow was to jeopardize the city's safety, angering the gods and inviting disaster. Rome's enemies might be at the gates, famine might stalk the land, or plague might spread, and a Vestal's impurity could be seen as the cause. Thus, their personal choices were entwined with the fate of an empire. When a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow, the trial was not merely a legal matter, but a sacred crisis. She was judged not only by men, but by the gods. The Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, often a political figure as well as a religious one, oversaw the proceedings. If the charge was upheld, the sentence was inevitable. A Vestal could not simply be executed by ordinary means, for spilling her blood was considered sacrilege. She was too sacred to be killed outright. And so Rome devised a punishment that combined death with ritual, burial alive. The ritual of execution was as chilling as the fate itself. The condemned Vestal was dressed as if for a wedding, a grim parody of the life she might have lived had she not been chosen for the priesthood. She wore bridal robes, her head veiled, her appearance meant to evoke both purity and finality. But instead of walking to a husband's home, she walked to her grave. Led in silence through the streets of Rome, she was paraded as a living warning. The crowd watched solemnly, for to see a Vestal condemned was rare and terrifying. Rome prided itself on the sanctity of these women, and their downfall suggested the gods' anger. The people whispered prayers, but none could intervene. The state demanded sacrifice, and the goddess demanded purity. Her destination was a subterranean chamber near the city walls, prepared for her burial. Inside the chamber were placed a small lamp, a couch, some food, and water. These were not acts of mercy, but legal fictions. By providing sustenance, the Romans claimed they were not directly murdering her. Instead, she would die of suffocation, thirst, or despair. In this way, the responsibility was shifted to fate and the gods, rather than the executioners. Once inside, the Vestal descended a narrow staircase into the darkness. The door was sealed, earth was shoveled over the entrance, and the city above continued its life. Beneath the soil, she remained alive for hours, perhaps days, her breath thickening, her body weakening, her lamp flickering, until the last flame went out. In that chamber, surrounded by silence and stone, she awaited the slow embrace of death. The horror of this punishment lay not only in its cruelty, but in its symbolism. The Vestal, once revered as sacred, was now entombed alive, erased from the city yet still within it. Her burial site became both a grave and a scar, a reminder of Rome's ruthless demand for order and purity. Unlike criminals or traitors whose bodies were broken publicly, The Vestal was destroyed quietly, hidden underground as if her shame itself had to be buried. What must it have felt like for those women? To be chosen as a child, raised in honor, revered by all of Rome, only to face a living tomb for a moment of weakness or love. Some may have been guilty, some perhaps innocent, but the sentence was absolute. The city could not risk divine wrath, and so the punishment had to be carried out. Historical accounts describe several Vestals who met this grim fate. In 114 BC, for example, 3 Vestals were accused of breaking their vows. One took her own life before trial, but the others were buried alive. Even in later centuries, when Rome was at the height of its power, the punishment remained unchanged. No matter how advanced the empire became, this ancient cruelty lingered at its core. The burial of Vestal Virgins reveals the stark contrast of Rome's world. This was a civilization of law and philosophy, of poets and emperors, yet it was also a world of superstition and ritual sacrifice. The Vestals embodied Rome's greatness, but their punishments embodied its fears. Beneath the marble and glory, Rome was haunted by the belief that one woman's failure could bring the empire to ruin. And so, beneath the soil, Rome buried not only its priestesses, but also its terror, its desperate need to appease the gods through human suffering. The burial of a Vestal Virgin did not simply end with her entombment. The memory of the event lingered long after the earth was sealed. For Romans, such punishments were both a reassurance and a terror. Reassurance that the gods had been appeased by removing impurity, and terror that the violation had occurred at all. When a Vestal was condemned, whispers of divine displeasure swept through the city. Would famine follow? Would enemies invade? Was this punishment enough to restore Rome's fragile pact with the heavens? The act was steeped in ritual symbolism. By providing food, water, and a lamp, the state claimed that it was not guilty of murder. The woman was left alive with means to survive, though everyone knew that survival was impossible. This legal fiction was Rome's way of preserving the sanctity of the Vestals, while ensuring their destruction. No blood was spilled, for blood would defile the sacred office. Instead, the silence of suffocation preserved ritual purity, even as the execution itself revealed the brutality lurking beneath Rome's devotion to the gods. One of the most infamous cases occurred in 114 BC, when 3 Vestals, Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia, were accused of breaking their vows. Their alleged lovers, members of Rome's elite, were also punished, but it was the women who suffered the ultimate fate. Ancient sources recount that Aemilia, as the chief Vestal, was buried alive, while Licinia and Marcia initially escaped conviction, only to later meet the same doom when the case was retried. The scandal rocked Rome, revealing both the vulnerabilities of its most sacred institution and the severity of its punishments. Centuries later, during the reign of Emperor Domitian, another Vestal named Cornelia was accused of unchastity. Ancient historians describe her execution in harrowing detail. She was led to her underground chamber, descended into the darkness, and when the earth closed above her, she cried out that she was innocent. Her pleas went unanswered. Rome's law and religion demanded sacrifice, and her voice was smothered by soil. For the women themselves, these punishments were not only physical, but profoundly psychological. Imagine the dread of walking the streets dressed as a bride, knowing the destination was not a husband's home, but a tomb. The silence of the crowd, the weight of centuries of tradition pressing upon them, the knowledge that they carried both their own fate and the supposed fate of Rome. It must have been unbearable. For some, despair may have set in long before the chamber closed. For others, hope clung desperately until the last flicker of the lamp vanished in the suffocating dark. The cruelty of these burials speaks volumes about Rome's contradictions. This was a civilization of immense sophistication, one that celebrated law, justice, and order. Yet its justice could be as merciless as any barbaric act. By placing divine duty above human compassion, Rome condemned women not for crimes of violence or treachery, but for private choices turned into public catastrophes. Their bodies were buried, but their stories remained, etched into the darker annals of Roman history. It is worth noting that the punishment was rare. Across nearly 1,000 years of Roman history, only a handful of Vestals were ever buried alive. Their rarity gave them weight. Each case was a seismic event, shaking confidence in Rome's stability and sparking anxiety over divine favor. The very scarcity of these punishments ensured that they remained burned into cultural memory, retold again and again by historians as proof of the terrible seriousness of a Vestal's vows. Over time, the role of the Vestals faded. As Christianity rose in Rome, the old pagan rites gave way to new faith. By the 4th century A.D., the order of the Vestal Virgins was officially disbanded. The sacred flame of Vesta, kept burning for centuries by these women, was extinguished forever. The fear of divine punishment shifted into a new religious framework, but the haunting memory of Vestals buried alive endured. For Christians, their fates became examples of pagan cruelty. For historians, they stood as evidence of the lengths Rome would go to preserve its sense of order. Today, the image of a Vestal Virgin buried alive still resonates as one of the most haunting punishments in history. It combines ritual purity with cruelty, religion with terror, and devotion with death. It forces us to confront the extremes of belief and the sacrifices demanded in the name of divine favor. The young girls taken from their families and placed into service of the goddess carried immense honor, but with that honor came a terrible shadow. At any moment, one misstep, one accusation, could turn a life of reverence into a living tomb. The story of the Vestal Virgins reveals a truth that echoes across civilizations, that power, faith, and fear are often entwined. Rome built its greatness not only on military conquest and law, but also on its rituals that demanded the lives of women who symbolized the city's fate. When a Vestal fell, Rome responded with cruelty masked as piety, burying her alive to reassure itself that order had been restored. And so, beneath the marble monuments and grand arches, beneath the legends of emperors and generals, lie the forgotten tombs of women who once carried the fire of Rome. Their deaths remind us that history is not only built by the powerful, but also scarred by the silenced, the innocent or guilty women entombed in the dark for the sins Rome could not forgive. If you found this story chilling, then join us here at Torture's Room, where we uncover the darkest punishments, the most brutal executions, and the forgotten victims of history. From the flames that consumed martyrs, to the wheels that shattered bones, from the stones that crushed bodies, to the earth that swallowed the living, we bring to light the cruelty humanity has inflicted in the name of order, faith, and power. Subscribe now and descend with us into the shadows of history, where the silence of the grave still whispers, and where the buried past waits to be uncovered.